A quiet voice, a cozy story, and rain outside the window. It's all here for you. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing. Do you listen at bedtime or during the day to unwind? It started with the cupboard, the smallest one above the sink, the one I never really used. One evening, as I reached for a mug, I heard it. A whisper. Not loud enough to be a word, but just enough to stop me mid-motion. I paused, hand still in the air, and listened. Nothing. No wind, no floorboard creak. But the silence after, it felt different. Not empty, full almost. Like someone had just said something kind and then left the room. I brushed it off that first time. A product of being alone too long, maybe. I'd been in the apartment for months now, living mostly in the rhythm of routine morning coffee, emails I didn't want to answer, short walks with no destination, books read in a half doze. The kind of solitude that wraps around you like a blanket you're not sure you asked for. But after that night, it kept happening. Not every day, not on command, but sometimes at the end of a sentence in a book, just before I turned the page, I'd feel it again. A soft presence, not a sound, but the shape of sound, like the ghost of someone's voice brushing the air. I began reading aloud at night. Nothing dramatic, just softly, under my breath, as I sat by the window with the lamp on low. Poetry, mostly, short things, sometimes just a sentence or two. And each time I did, something in the room shifted just slightly. Like the air settled, like the walls leaned in. I never said her name. I didn't need to. If it was her, she already knew. The apartment had once been ours. A long time ago, before time turned us into separate people with similar memories. She loved this space, said it felt like a place where thoughts could breathe. When she left, she took almost nothing. Said she wanted to start fresh. I understood, but I never moved. Couldn't, not because I was waiting, but because the silence felt familiar. And slowly, lately, it had begun to feel inhabited again, not by grief, not by memory, but by something quieter, like the trace of a voice that hadn't been spoken in years, still lingering in the corners of the room. I didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell, just a cupboard that sometimes sighed, a book that fell open to pages we used to read, a whisper that didn't ask for attention, only for me to listen. I began to test it not with doubt, but with care, not like someone trying to prove a haunting, but more like someone talking to an old house they don't want to leave. At first, I'd say small things aloud. A simple, "I'm home," as I walked in. Or, "That one was good," after I finished a chapter. Not every time, and never expecting an answer, but the room seemed to hold those words differently than it used to. The stillness wasn't just a lack of sound. It was attentive. Like the silence wasn't waiting to speak, but rather to hear. One evening, while making tea, I told a story aloud. Something she used to laugh at, the one about the umbrella, the pigeon, and the stranger who mistook me for a street musician. I hadn't thought of it in years, but it fell from my lips so easily. And right as I reached the part where I used to pause, the light above the stove flickered, once, not harshly, not dramatically, just enough to catch my breath mid-sentence. I smiled, not because I believed it was her, not exactly, but because I believed in what she left behind, the stillness that once listened to us both. That night, I read her favorite poem aloud, the one she always claimed wasn't sad, just tired in the right places. I sat on the floor back against the wall, the book on my knees. When I finished the last line, I whispered it again, softer. You do not have to be whole to be here. And the silence that followed wrapped around me like a memory that remembered me back. There was comfort in it. Not the kind that fills loneliness, but the kind that gives it a place to sit beside you without shame. I didn't know what I was doing, really. Whether I was conjuring her or just learning to inhabit the space she once filled. But either way, the room began to feel less like a container and more like a participant. The way a friend doesn't always speak, but still lets you talk. And in the quiet moments after I'd spoken, or laughed, or just breathed with the window open, I felt it again. That faint trace of something, not quite voice, not quite memory, just presence. Like the echo of someone listening with their whole self. And I realized I wasn't trying to remember her. I was learning how not to forget. It was buried in the bottom drawer, the one filled with tangled chargers, old adapters, and things I never threw away because I didn't know if I'd need them someday. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to clean out the noise. But there it was. A small gray recorder, plastic slightly yellowed, the buttons stiff but familiar. She used to use it when she had trouble sleeping, would record thoughts in the middle of the night instead of writing them down. Sometimes I'd hear the faint click of the red button as she turned over in bed. Too many ideas, she'd say with a half smile, and nowhere to put them. I hadn't thought about it in years, but as I turned it over in my hands, something in me paused, that soft internal stillness that comes just before a memory tries to surface. I pressed play. The first few seconds were static, the low buzz of an empty room, then her voice. Not dramatic, not sad, just tired, familiar. It's 2:43 in the morning, she says, and the building across the street has one light still on. A long silence follows, then quieter. I like that someone else is still here, awake. My thumb hovered over the pause button, but I didn't press it. Her voice continued, shifting in and out of clarity, like a thought returning. She wasn't speaking to anyone, just herself, just the dark. Sometimes I think if I speak these things out loud, they won't feel so heavy. Another pause. Sometimes I think, even if no one hears it, maybe I'll feel heard. I let the recorder play until it clicked off on its own, then sat there, holding it, letting her voice echo in the quiet we had once shared. I didn't cry, not out of strength, but because it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like she had simply walked into the other room and left the door open. That night, I left the recorder on the windowsill, not to charge, not to use, just to let it rest in the open air. And as I sat beside it, reading aloud like I always did, I found myself pausing more. Not because I forgot the words, but because I wanted to leave space for her, for whatever might still be listening, not in the walls, not in the machine, but in the quiet that now belonged to both of us. and maybe always had. It had been weeks since I left the apartment for more than groceries or air. The silence inside had grown warm, familiar, no longer heavy but full, like a soft coat you forget you're wearing. But that morning, I felt something shift. Not a push, not a longing, just a quiet suggestion. Go out. No plan, no destination, just movement. The streets were calm. Early spring sun filtered through bare branches, and the city, always too fast or too loud, felt briefly in step with me. I walked slowly, without headphones, letting the outside sounds fold gently into my rhythm birds, tires rolling over damp asphalt, someone unlocking a gate. I passed the bookstore on the corner, the one she used to love, where the floors creaked and the poetry was always misfiled. I stepped inside, more from memory than intent. The bell above the door chimed softly. A young woman stood near the back, holding a small paperback. She was reading aloud, just under her breath, not performing, but like she needed to say the words to hear them properly. I couldn't make out the poem, only fragments. But her voice, it wasn't the same as hers, not truly. But something in the cadence, the way she lifted the last syllable of each line, made me stop mid-step. I closed my eyes, listened, and for a moment I could hear her again. Not the recording, not memory, just the echo of a tone that used to carry through our home like evening light through curtains. When the young woman finished, she smiled quietly to herself, placed the book back on the shelf, and left. She never saw me. I didn't speak, but I lingered there a long time, tracing my fingers along the book she had held. It was a small collection, unfamiliar title, a name I didn't know, but I bought it anyway. Back in the apartment, I sat by the window and opened to a random page. The first line read, "I keep finding pieces of you in people who don't know they're carrying them." I closed the book, let it rest on my knees, and realized something simple. Maybe she wasn't a ghost, or a memory, or a sound in the walls. Maybe she had just become part of the world, dissolved into the cracks of the everyday. A phrase on a stranger's tongue, a line in a forgotten book, the softness of someone pausing before they speak. And all I had to do to find her again was to listen. Not for her, but like her. It started quietly. A single slip of paper, torn from the edge of an old notepad, folded once and tucked into a novel she used to reread every autumn. I wrote one sentence in pencil. "You were always drawn to endings that sounded like beginnings." I didn't think much of it, not as a gesture, not even as memory. More like breathing, the kind of exhale that leaves a shape in the cold air and disappears. A few days later, another note, then another. Always in books I knew she'd touched. Sometimes a line we used to whisper to each other during long silences. Sometimes a half-thought. Once, "This room still holds your laugh." I didn't expect anyone to read them. I wasn't writing for anyone, not even for her really. Just continuing a conversation that hadn't asked to end. But 2 weeks later, something changed. I pulled a poetry collection from the shelf, one of the thinner ones, slightly warped from steam where she once left it in the bathroom. And inside was a folded scrap of paper, not mine. Different paper, different hand. The writing was smaller, sharper. It read, "I don't know who you are, but I feel less alone when I read your notes." That was all. No name, no attempt to guess. Just presence, echo, a voice meeting another in the quiet space between them. I sat down on the floor, back against the bookshelf, the note still in my hand, and for the first time since she left, I felt something that wasn't longing or memory, but continuity, the sense that whatever we had built hadn't ended with silence, but had folded gently into someone else's day. That evening, I placed a new note in a different book, not a response, not directly, but a continuation. You're allowed to belong here, even if you don't know why. After that, I began to notice others. Not many, just enough. A line circled in pen that hadn't been there before. A paper clip left on a page about listening. A second voice in the margins, small and quiet. They weren't mine. They weren't hers. But they were real. And in a world that so often demands noise to prove presence, these small shared silences felt like proof that someone else was breathing beside me, even if we never met, even if we never would. I was looking for something else entirely. An old photo, I think, or maybe just distraction when I came across the phone. Her old one, tucked away in the bottom of a box marked Misk. I hadn't powered it on since she left. It was too full of her, too final. But now, for some reason I can't explain, I held the weight of it in my palm and plugged it in. It buzzed once, screen dim, familiar background, flickering to life. A photo of her slippers by the window. I smiled before I could stop myself. I scrolled past the messages, the photos, all frozen in a time I didn't feel ready to re-enter. But the voice memos, that's where my thumb paused. 32 files, all untitled, all dated at odd hours. One in the middle of the night, another during a rainstorm I remembered by the sound it made against the glass. I played the first one. Her voice, tired but steady. Note to self, buy more tea. The good kind, not the one that tastes like bark. I laughed quietly. Not from joy, not from grief, from recognition. The next. That book about the blind photographer. I liked it, but I don't know why. Maybe I don't need to. The next. Do you ever feel like certain hours in the day aren't meant to be used? Like they just exist so we can hear our own breath? Each one was like stepping into a room she had just left, her voice still in the air, her thoughts still drifting near the surface. She hadn't recorded them for me. She hadn't expected anyone to hear them. But somehow, they were here. Now, soft markers in time. Moments she chose not to keep silent. I listened to 12 of them in a row. Some were just fragments, a hum, a breath, a sentence cut off mid-thought. One was a recording of wind chimes, no words at all, but they all carried her. Her rhythm, her quiet resistance to forgetting. That night, I didn't read aloud. I sat by the window and let the chimes from her recording blend with the real ones outside. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence because she already had. And now, I was simply holding it, carefully, as she once had held me, not tightly, not forever, just long enough to let me know I was heard. The package arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, just my name, written in neat, almost formal handwriting, the kind you don't see much anymore. The envelope was soft, slightly padded, not heavy. I wasn't expecting anything. and for a brief moment I wondered if it was a mistake. But the handwriting there was something careful about it, not familiar, but intentional. Inside was a book, a slim volume of prose, nothing I recognized, no note, no explanation, just the book and slipped between its pages, a folded piece of cream-colored paper. I sat down before opening it. Something in me already knew this wasn't random. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was blockier, more angular, but the words belonged to her. On the page, written in pencil, "You said this room made your thoughts feel like they could breathe." I feel that now, too. It wasn't a quote. It wasn't a line from any of the recordings. But it was something she had said to me years ago one evening when we had no heat and were wrapped in mismatched blankets, reading with gloved fingers. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't written it down. But here it was, carefully preserved in someone else's hand. I held the note for a long time, looked at the book. It was filled with underlined passages, soft pencil marks, faint impressions, the kind of reading that isn't rushed, as if someone had gone through it not to study but to stay. I turned the pages slowly. In the margins, a few more notes. Never about the plot, only about the feeling. This line sits quietly. This sentence feels like coming home. Are you still with me? That last one made me pause. I'd said those words myself many times, reading aloud into the room, never expecting an answer. And now they were being asked back. I didn't know who sent it. I didn't need to. This wasn't about a sender. It was about a connection that moved beyond the visible, the expected. Something passed gently from one pair of hands to another, not with urgency, but with care. That evening, I placed the book on the shelf where she used to keep her favorites. I didn't write anything in return. Not yet. I wanted to let it sit, to let it breathe. Because some conversations don't need to continue. They just need to be held, even silently. I no longer wait for signs. I no longer tilt my head toward the cupboard or replay the recordings late at night. Not because I've let go, but because I've understood. Her presence was never meant to be summoned like a memory. It was meant to settle like dust in a quiet room, soft and constant. Now I simply speak, not always aloud, sometimes just in thought. But when I do, I don't speak to the absence. I speak into the space knowing it holds more than air. Some nights I still read at the window, voice low, rhythm slow, but it's not for her anymore. Not just. It's for the room, for the others who've left notes, for the girl in the bookstore, for the stranger who mailed me back her words. I read because someone, somewhere, might need to hear that quiet isn't the same as gone. I leave more notes now, not just in her books, but in others too. A sentence, a question. Once, just a folded page that read, "It's okay to feel everything at once. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they stay. That's not mine to decide. I've come to believe the room is listening, even when I'm not speaking. That presence isn't always about people. Sometimes it's about attention. A way of noticing that becomes a kind of love. And love, I think now, doesn't always need to touch or speak. Sometimes it just waits, quietly, until you're ready to sit beside it. The recorder sits on the shelf, quiet. The book with her phrase rests between others, its spine soft from revisiting. And the phone, her phone, remains off. I don't need it to hear her. I hear her in the way the floor creaks when I walk into the room slowly, in the light that lands on the exact spot where she once used to sit, legs curled beneath her, in the breath I take before opening my mouth to speak. I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in echoes, in what we leave behind unintentionally, and in the people who stay behind to listen to those traces. I suppose that's what I am now. Not a keeper, not a mourner, just someone who listens with care, who lets silence be filled not with questions, but with presence. And every so often, when I close a book or reach for a mug, I hear it again, that shape of sound, that breath of voice. Not hers exactly, but close enough. And I whisper back, always softly, I'm still here. Are you?